Let's do it.
All right, here we are for another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup, got my coffee ready to roll. And of course, we have another outstanding guest joining us, Sarah DeLuca, who is new to the WPC family. Sarah, we're doing the coffee talks as a way to introduce people to the folks who are part of the WPC network, WPC family, so people can know about everyday people doing great work in their communities. A lot of times people see you at the conference or the symposiums, you're presenting, you're in and out, and we don't really get a chance to let folks know about the great work you're doing long after you leave the symposium or the conference. So that's what this is an opportunity to do. So we're glad you're here. Let's start by just asking you to introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is so great to be able to connect with you, Eddie, and connect with the folks who are part of WPC. I am Sarah DeLuca. I run Move Money, Shift Power. I'm a money and philanthropy coach for progressive, wealthy folks. So I work with people who have some wealth and class privilege, who want to move that wealth and that power to social justice causes and to movement work, and want to figure out how and sort of like the most effective way to do that, and unpacking all of the feelings and things that, as you can imagine, a lot comes up when you talk about money. So we get into all the nitty gritty of that.
Yeah. Well, I got a lot to ask you about that because, this conversation about money is a really interesting one. But let me start with, how did you get the title? I mean, Move Money, Shift Power. Is that something how did that come to you?
Oh my gosh. I feel like it's been a part of how I describe the work for a long time. I came to this as an organizer, and I was a fundraiser for about a decade, working in social change work. And I saw, and sort of that's where I developed the analysis of how money is just like, it's a form of power, and it's a form that can be moved to really good things. It can be moved to really bad things, and figured out that that was sort of like giving as a way of activism for people who have wealth. Like, some people are going to go out and march in the streets and go like tie themselves to, gates or whatever. And some people are just going to like write the check so that people can go do that and get out of jail. And so really thinking about how people with class privilege, like myself, with wealth, can be an active participant in movements and support the movements that they care about, while at the same time moving that money that they have, which often people have accumulated and families have accumulated through a history of systemic racism and a whole lot of things that we're carrying the sort of emotional baggage and guilt for, and wanting to change that analysis and that understanding. And so I always talked about how moving money is a way to shift power. And then just as I was figuring out what to call my business, it was like, oh wait, that's exactly it. So simple. Move money, shift power.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, it sounds like a rap song, to be honest with you, but I kind of like it. I was going to ask you, what kind of money are we talking about here? Without disclosing any of your clients or people you're working with. But I mean, I think when I hear money, I was just reading something about Kanye and, becoming a billionaire and selling shoes. Just been interesting to just follow that journey. But I'm just wondering, when people have that kind of money, what amount are we talking about? And can you give us a sense, when you say money, move money, shift power, I'm thinking $10,000.
Yeah.
What are you thinking when what? Give me a sense of that.
Yeah. And it really varies on the person. Most of my clients that I work with on a one-on-one basis are moving around $50,000 or more each year. And we work on figuring out like, what is the amount that makes sense for them? And what would it mean to spend down, say, an inheritance that's come down year after year? And do we have frank conversations about, if you have $5 million sitting in a bank account or in whatever investments, do your kids really need $5 million? Or are they fine? Are they set? Do they already have their college paid off and their house all set? Like, what if they only inherited some of that and you were able to redistribute a lot more of that money into the movements that you care about, into actually making change in the world and not just continuing on with your families? So
yeah, that's helpful. Now, you mentioned some of the history of how people got that money,
yeah.
got that inheritance. I mean, what role does that play? It makes me wonder, is the motivation guilt, or is the motivation substance trying to make a difference? And I don't know if either one of those answers matter, but I just wonder, what's your sense of what's motivating people and that history and how it ties into that?
Yeah, and it's totally different for everyone. Like, everyone has their own understanding of where they come from when they first start doing the work. For myself, I know that when I first started organizing, when I first started working in nonprofit spaces and doing grassroots work, I started as a white savior. Like, that's where I came into the work. I was like, oh, these poor people, I am this, like, you know, college educated, well-off person. I can help educate them. I problematic, I know. And then sort of as I've developed my own analysis and understanding and unlearned some things that I grew up with, and figuring all of that out, I've changed my understanding where it's not just like my guilt about the inheritance that I received and things like that. So I think, I don't know, the short answer is probably it's a mix of both. But a lot of the folks that I work with do have inherited wealth where they didn't make the money themselves, and so they don't feel as connected to keeping the money, and they see it as, I didn't deserve this money, and so I know who does deserve this money. And as I work in activism and as I do organizing work all over the place, I realize, like, these folks need the money a lot more than I do.
Yeah. I wonder, is it difficult? Well, first, let me just admit that this is a pure assumption on my part. That the people you're dealing with are mostly white people.
Mostly, but not exclusively.
Okay. So, but I also feel that sometimes, even if they're people of color, that often they're possibly giving money or wanting to give or support a organization or an organization serving people that they often haven't had very much experience with. And so I'm just wondering, what's been your sense of how people decide where they give that money to? Is it, if the experience hasn't been kind of lived, so to speak? So what's been your sense of how people decide if they want to go to, Boys and Girls Club? Why? What? I'm just always curious how people make that decision.
Yeah. And with my clients, we always start with what their values are and what is the world that you want to see? What is the world that you want to be a part of? And when we get into that and we think about what does that future look like, then we can decide what are those best organizations. And I really push people to give to places where you're not just handing over a check and holding that over people's heads, but being in right relationship with the organization. So it's like, if you're going to give a 5-figure gift to an organization, like, get on the phone with the executive director, get on the phone with, somebody on staff to get to know them and be in relationship with them more than just like, I give you this money and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
I push people to not do it anonymously so that they can have that relationship, so that they can have that conversation with folks and be more than just a checkbook to a group. And there's a lot of great social justice funds that are set up across the country that do either national funding or local community funding, where they are connected to the organizations. And so you can give a big gift to them, and then they decide on a panel of grassroots organizers. They're the ones that decide who get the money from there. And so you're giving up that power of even making the decision.
Okay, yeah. Well, I want to ask you to talk to or say something to nonprofit folks out there who may not know about those kinds of options. Like, what would be your advice to those folks? But before that, I want to ask you, did you grow up saying, I want to move money, shift power? How did you get to this point?
A very roundabout way, as I think many of us have in life. I always grew up as an activist. I was the kid who was super stubborn, and whenever somebody told me that I had to do it a certain way, I was like, but why? But why does it have to be that way? Like, I would tell my mom about all these like travels and things that I want to do. And she's like, well, you better marry somebody rich. And I was like, no, I'm going to make my own money. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to prove you wrong. And so that made for me to be a really annoying child, I'm sure. And then I sort of honed that into being an activist and being an organizer. And as I started fundraising and realized that I really enjoyed talking to people about money, and had no problem asking people for money. Like, it still gave me some butterflies to ask people for a big sum of money, but I really enjoyed getting into those conversations with people about money and power and why they were making the decisions they were making about where they were funding.
Yeah.
And turns out not everybody likes to do that. So.
Yeah, well, that brings me to the question about, those folks who need to do that, nonprofit leaders, nonprofit board members. If you were coaching a group of people, I mean, giving them some advice about asking for money, what would be your, couple-minute PSA to really assist them in taking on this challenge?
I think the biggest thing is it's all about relationship building. It's all about connecting with people and figuring out who are the people that are already in your circle that you can talk to, and then have them introduce you to that next level and that next layer of people. But building authentic relationships on both sides, from the philanthropist, from the organization, that is the work. And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. And so I know I talk to a lot of organizations that have just a couple staff and they don't have the time to do as much of that relationship building. But I really think that is the biggest piece to growing your donor base and to building up those relationships with donors who are going to be with you for the long haul.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of problems in the foundation world that make it harder for organizations to get the funding that they need, that they should be able to access. And I do a lot of pushing against the foundation world that wants epic reports and proposals and all of these loops, all of these holes that you have to jump through for organizations to get the funding. It's just like, just make it easy for them.
Yeah.
And do it multi-year.
Yeah, that's helpful. I want to ask a little bit about kind of those reports and some of the hurdles and barriers in reference to that. But I was going to also ask you what we find sometimes. What we do at the White Privilege Conference is really looking at these topics associated with white supremacy, white privilege, other forms of oppression. And sometimes I've found that being a person of color in a leadership position can prevent me from securing funding from a potential funder, because as we alluded to earlier, they may not have had a lot of experience with Black leadership, Black excellence, or people of color leadership. In fact, there may be some suspicion, some hesitancy. And so I wonder, I mean, what does race have to do with philanthropy? How does it play in? What are the challenges when you talk about not only race, gender identity, some of the other identifiers? Can you just talk a little bit about how some of those issues play out in the work that you do?
Yeah, and it's a huge issue. And as I'm sure you know, as an executive director, there are all these problems, as you just mentioned, where people just don't know, and so they don't trust. And that, I think, is the biggest piece, is just like trust people to know what their community needs, what their people like, what people need. Like, I always push people to be funding organizations with a level of trust of like, they know, like, folks who are in marginalized communities know what folks in marginalized communities need. I don't know. Again, going back to me as a white savior, like, I didn't know what folks needed when I was working, in Baltimore on food issues. Like, that's not my place in the organizing world. And so for my work, it's about pushing philanthropy and pushing individual donors to think beyond what is in their bubble of what they think of when they think of getting social change done, getting any sort of charity work done. Of like, maybe you don't know the answers. Just because you have the wealth doesn't mean you know exactly what folks need, and push people beyond that. So
Yeah,
I don't know if that fully answered your question.
no. I mean, for me, it's just helpful to be able to at least name it, have conversation. So I'm wondering, like, when you're presenting, when you're setting up these kind of learning opportunities, what are you wanting people to take away from their 75-minute, 90-minute session with you?
Yeah, I want folks to think bigger about what they are doing right now, and think about risking a little bit more with their money, and thinking beyond what their family situation is, and think broader about what their community is and what their community needs. So I really work to push people to give more money than they ever have or even ever thought of. And I also just want people to have more conversations with people about money. Again, breaking down some of these barriers, breaking down some of these things about, like, why is it that, one person gets paid X number of dollars at a company or an organization, and this other person doesn't make that same amount? But actually start unpacking the conversation around money so that it becomes a less taboo subject. Because by keeping it behind closed doors and by keeping money this quiet thing, like I was taught growing up, like, we just don't talk about it, we're keeping the systems in place. We're keeping that oppressive system in place. So by having more conversations about it, whether it's with your family or your coworkers or whomever, we're starting to break down some of those barriers.
Yeah. Now, do you or have you produced like cheat sheets, or here's what you say, or here's some tips, whether board member or executive director? I mean, do you have those kinds of things, or talk to people about those kinds of things?
Yeah, I have a few sort of cheat sheets for donors about like how to give in a social change framework, and how to be, it's like, transparent with the organizations, multi-year gifts, trust the people that you're giving to, and think about systemic change, not just about immediate needs, although in the climate we're in right now, we need both, definitely. So I have a few things like that, and try to just sort of shake those money trees a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about, the time we're in now, COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, if you follow the market or, pay attention to money kinds of things, it's almost like everything pauses, it's like, one, I wonder, do people make money off crisis? That's been some of the stuff we're seeing and reading about, and I'm trying to make sense of that. But let me ask you this: so COVID-19, right? Like, what, as we've had to pause as a nation and really kind of hold still for a second, what has this pause taught you about money, the work you do, where we are as a nation, where we are? What has pandemic or quarantine, COVID-19 taught you about where we are as a nation when it comes to move money, shift power.
Yeah. And even broader than that, I think this pandemic has shown us the strain on the middle class, the strain on some set of people, and where some folks are totally fine. There's, the people that can work from home and continue to collect a salary and business as usual, and those businesses are still functioning and doing their work. And then there's the folks that either can't go to work right now because their jobs have ended or been furloughed, or the people that have, are working in a grocery store or, an Amazon delivery location or something like that, that have to go to work and are faced with a whole bunch of health concerns. And I mean, even not just the people that are able to stay working from home, but the folks that were able to, say, leave New York City and go up to their summer home and just camp out there for a while to get out of the city, and just see the vast difference between and the inequality that exists. That's the biggest thing and the most eye-opening thing to see right now.
Yeah. Now, I mean, how are you doing? Like quarantine, I'm wondering, like how we're asking people how they're doing, their families are doing, but what's your sense of the community around you? What's your sense of how folks are doing around you to the best that you can get a sense of that?
Yeah. So my community is doing pretty well. Most of the people in my core friend and family group are able to work from home. My sister's a nurse, so her job is pretty tricky right now, as she's in a hospital that sometimes she's working on the COVID floor and getting all suited up and hoping for the best, and telling lots of horror stories about what's going on there. But I also see the number of businesses that have shut down and the number of organizations that are struggling because all of their government funding, all their foundation funding has dried up. And they're looking for, how are they going to replace that big gala that they were planning for next month? How are they going to continue to meet with donors or, continue to do the work? I talked to a lot of electoral organizers about what that organizing looks like right now. And as they're trying to pivot and figure out what the new organizing system looks like, and how to continue to pay their staff.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I hate to say it's a mess. That seems so broad, but it's interesting to see what's going on in the different people we talked about in different places. Let me ask you this. I sometimes wonder, how soon should you talk to kids about money? And what kind of conversations do you begin with? Particularly when you talk about, the super privileged, the super wealthy. What's your sense of, what's your advice around that?
That is such a key topic that I talk about with a lot of people as they're raising kids, and talking about, we joke about, like, you don't want to be the parents that you hear the horror stories about of, like, my parents never talked to me about money and then I got it and then we never talked about it. And it's so, I think there's definitely age appropriate things that you can talk to kids about. And just the value of money and what it means to have a dollar, to have an allowance that you can decide where you can be putting that money towards, or are you saving it? And I think there's definitely, I don't know exactly, I'm not going to say, I know exactly, I'm not a parent myself, so I don't know all the answers. Even if I was a parent, I don't think I would have all the answers to that. But I think there's age appropriate things that you can talk to about with kids. And for me, my dad taught me a lot about finances and the stock market. And we nerded out together about math a lot. And I think that's where I developed my love of math. But just sort of understanding that, and my dad showing me things when I was in high school about, like, this is our retirement plan, and this is how we're going to do these other things. And I think there are some good conversations you can have with kids, but then also be open to when there are opportunities to say, oh, here is something that we have that this other family doesn't have. Let's talk about why that is. And start to unpack sort of those early things.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. I mean, I think that's just an ongoing learning topic that we got to explore. You mentioned specifically white savior, and I feel in my work and the work we've seen at the conference, white savior, white woman is different for other kinds of populations. So I'm wondering if you were talking to parents of young white girls and wanting and to help them not to be where you were, not that that was the intention of the parenting around you, but what is it that you maybe wish you could have learned or could have known that could have, you know, maybe interrupted that or prevented that to some extent?
I think a big part of it is just who's in your environment and who's in your community, and getting to see a variety and getting to know a variety of people in income levels and not be in our little isolated bubbles. I personally went to Catholic school for all of junior high and high school, and there was one Black family in the whole school. And I just didn't know any people who were different than me. And I think that is such an important thing, to get to have different experiences, get to see different things, get to understand people's different lives, is so important to build, again, deep relationships with others, and get to see other parts of society. And then ideally parents can unpack some of those things with their kids and have some maybe hard conversations about what that looks like, whether you're the haves or the have-nots.
Yeah. So when you think about the next 10 years of moving money, shifting power, what's on the horizon? What are you thinking about? What are some possible goals and aspirations over the next 10 years?
Are you saying overall or for the business?
I think for you and overall as well. Yes.
For me, it's building this movement. It's getting more folks to wake up to their wealth privilege, and move a lot more money that is just sort of sitting stagnant, waiting for that rainy day or that moment. It's like, now is the rainy day. Like, now is the time to, you know, not just have a foundation in perpetuity. In perpetuity for what? Like, this is the time to move the money. In terms of like what the future that I want to see, I mean, I would love to see a future where we have queer Black women in charge of a lot more things, and in real leadership and power. And how we're going to get there, I think, is just continuing to talk to people and continuing to break down some of these conversations and build the movements that we want to see, and keep that idealist nature that I have and I hope other people continue to have that fire too.
Yeah. And overall, what's been the response to your mission vision, your organization over the years you've been doing it?
Yeah. I think, like you, the first thing is just intrigue about, like, what does that mean? Like, how do you move money? What do you even do? And then it's, I get either people who are excited to be a part of it and saying like, yeah, we do need that, because they see it from the nonprofit side or they see it from the donor side, and sometimes both. And there's definitely some people who aren't ready for it, who are just like, oh, you do your little thing over there, and sort of push me off as just like a side, you know, too progressive for her own good kind of thing. But I think more folks are waking up to the needs of society, and that we need a lot more safety nets for people in our society to have basic human necessities taken care of. and it's going to take a lot of shifting power to get us there.
Yeah, yeah. And to the extent that you have any contact with young people, let's say 15 to 25, what's your sense as you look at yourself, reflect on you when you were 15 to 25, what's your sense of, has there been a change in that mindset? Is there any growth, any improvement? What's your sense of the young folks who have access, power, privilege, resources, and the kind of families and organizations that you're around?
I am so impressed with the young people who have such a stronger analysis on wealth, power, racial justice than I did at that age. And I've talked to people who are 19, 20 years old, and I'm like, holy crap, like I did not have that kind of analysis and understanding of the world that they do. So I'm really inspired by what young people are pulling together and doing in the world. I mean, it's been young people that started, one of the groups that started the Share My Check movement with the stimulus checks. That's been really cool to see, people really wanting to take a stimulus check that they receive that they don't need and redistribute it to folks who were left out of that, whether they're undocumented or indigenous or sex workers or whomever. That's been really inspiring to see. And yeah, these are the next leaders. So let's keep building them up and supporting them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, speaking of Share Your Check, it was interesting to see, what was it, Harvard get this check amount of whatever big number that was. Now, I think they gave it back. I don't know. I know Shake Shack, they talked about taking it back, but I think it would have been interesting to know, like, what would someone do with that money if they had to give it back to the common good? You know? And if that was, again, the kind of mindset in place that if you make 20 million a year and you get a $15 million bonus, I'm not saying don't buy an island, just buy a portion of the island instead of the whole island. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm all of that to say, my question, our motto at the Privilege Institute is if you have a lot, you should do a lot. And I'm wondering, in your circle, in your experience in the world you're operating in, what's your sense of those who have money, power, and privilege, and their give back, their contribution back? I'm not saying that they, again, have to give it all away, but at least an equivalence to the amount that they have in excess. Do you feel like that is, what's your assessment of how well the super privilege is doing in reference to giving back?
Yeah, and it varies. I would say to the person who makes that $20 million or $15 million bonus or whatever, like, buy an island, but then take that same amount of money and go put it towards, you know, one of the social justice funds, or give it to an organization that's going to redistribute that out into the community. And like, don't make the decision about where that's going. Don't put it into a foundation that you then run, which I can call out a few big philanthropists and big wealthy folks that do that. But like, actually move it to people who are going to make the decision instead of you, because there's a lot more that can be done. And yeah, I think the people that I'm in community with, the people that I'm working with that already have this social justice vision, they're moving big money, and they do this on a smaller scale. I know people that have, like, they really like nice, fancy designer clothes. And so every time they splurge and buy a big ticket item, they then take that money and go redistribute it. So if they buy a $300 purse, $300 go into an organization. They're like, yes, I know I do this, but also this other thing.
Yeah.
So,
that's, I mean, if we can have an initiative like that across the nation, that's a great start. I'm just going to ask you a little kind of selfish question on the part of the
Go
Privilege
for it.
Institute, the White Privilege Conference, right?
Yeah.
Because often we get, if you change the name, you might get more support.
Mm.
So what's your advice to me and my board? Because we name it and we're not ashamed about that. But with that name, we sometimes face some hurdles in reference to philanthropic support.
Mm. You should keep naming it. You should not change that to like water things down for people. Like, no. The same reason that my organization is Move Money, Shift Power. It's strong, it's powerful, it stands for something. The Privilege Institute, just like that is powerful. And you should continue to stand to that. And there's a part of me that wonders if it's not about the name as to why philanthropy is turned off by that. I imagine there's something a little bit deeper. Would be my suspicion, that there's a little bit more about like who your board is, or frankly what any people look like and what race they are, and just being a little bit thrown off and jarred by a Black man in power. That would be my assumption. I don't actually know which foundations you're talking about, but
Yeah. And
no.
I'm not naming any, but I'm wondering from your experience, I think for us and for myself, I'll say for me, are those people out there that will support Black leadership, Black genius in an organization named the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute? I think that's the ray of hope I'm looking for. In your experience, do you think those folks are out there?
They are out there,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep grinding. We'll keep pushing.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I think about the people that are funding like Black Voters Matter and some of these new organizations that are popping up and just like growing. And maybe they're not just popping up, but they're popping up on my radar, where people are really starting to look at some of that and realize that we have to go outside of just what my little, suburban bubble says. But you got to dig for it. You can't just, continue in your bubble.
Yeah, that's helpful. I was reading a story. I don't know the details. I don't remember the guy's name in the organization, but there's a guy, he used to be a white supremacist, or at least there was pictures of him participating in some white supremacist organizations in his early 20s or maybe late teens. And now he's, making these apps and making all this kind of money. And they finally, the only reason they had never uncovered his participation is because when he was arrested, the name that they use is a misspelling to the name that he actually has. And this just came out in the last, week or so, right? But it made me think, now this guy is saying, hey, that's not who I am today. I'm not that person. And I want to believe him, but it made me wonder, because what I'm saying is, if you participated in or benefited from white supremacy in that way, or participated in white supremacy in that way, you should be considering supporting organizations that are fighting white supremacy. And it doesn't just have to be the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute, the Southern Poverty Law Center. There's other great organizations that do that, but that's the thought that came to my mind is being more specific about moving money, shifting power, particularly if you perceived it in that way.
Yeah, I would say definitely there's something to like atoning for your own personal place in the world, and your atone for where your own money came from. I know a lot of folks that have done some digging into their own family history and whether they, I have family that most likely had a plantation in the South, and that's where their sort of, privilege, some of it started, or others who, bought property off Indigenous land. And so now they're giving back to Indigenous organizations for that particular land. Or I knew a donor back when I was fundraising who really, he changed his mind in his like 70s and 80s after he retired. And he's like, I am giving to all the environmental groups that were fighting me back when I had that corporate job. And now I'm giving all my money to them.
Yeah.
So there is like that personal, like, I need to atone for my personal, you know, impact in the world, or my family's impact in the world, and change that narrative for the future ancestors, you know.
Yeah, that's good to know. Well, if you run into some recovering white supremacists, send them our way. We'll be happy to work with them. We'll be happy to work with them. Or if they're listening out there, let them know that there is an organization. Let's ask you to close out with something fun and light.
Yeah.
Is what are you watching? What are you reading? What are you listening to? Is there anything you would recommend? We're creating a what to do in quarantine life. And it could be something that's educational, or it could be something that takes you away. Anything you'd like to add that you've seen recently, read to our list?
Yeah. So right before quarantine started, but I'll add it to the list anyway, because I think it's really great. I just finished Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler, which it's one of these like books that was written in the 90s about the 2020s and 2030s. And it's so amazing to see how parallel the world is. So if you want to get into some of that, it can be a little bit jarring, especially in this world that we're in. In terms of watching, my husband and I are actually watching The Americans right now. We had missed it when it was on the air. It's had like 6 seasons, but it's about some Russian spies in the 80s who are living in the US, and that's been really fun to have a little bit of escapism there.
Well, I'm a sucker for a spy movie for sure. That is one thing I do like. But I appreciate it, Sarah. It's so nice to officially reconnect with you. I know we ran into you quickly at WPS2 at Lesley University. We're looking forward to you continuing to be a part of the WPC family. And we'll have to call on you to maybe give us some tips as a board member, as board members, as a nonprofit, and keep up the good work. It's really great to see that you're doing the work you're doing. And as long as you want to be a part of the family, we'll take you, and we appreciate you sharing with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Eddie. It was great to be a part of this. Thank you for doing what you're doing. Keep up the great work, and keep standing in your power. We need you.
All right. I appreciate you. Peace.
All right. Bye.